Good afternoon and welcome to the MIT SDM Systems Thinking webinar series. My name is Naomi Gutierrez. I'm the alumni coordinator for SDM and I'm the host for today's webinar. SDM stands for System Design and Management, MIT's master's program for mid-career professionals. Offered jointly by the MIT Sloan School of Management and the MIT School of Engineering, SDM provides an education that focuses on integrating the technical, business, and socio-political components of complex challenges using systems thinking. Graduates earn an MS in Engineering and Management from MIT. The MIT SDM Systems Thinking webinar series features research conducted by SDM faculty, alumni, students, and industry partners. The series is designed to share information on how to apply systems thinking to address engineering, management, and socio-political components of complex challenges in virtually any domain. Recordings from prior SDM webinars can be accessed and viewed on demand at sdm.mit.edu. You will be sent a link to the slides and recording of today's webinar in about 1 week, along with the speaker's contact information. Today's webinar is being presented by SDM alumna Nissia Sabri, CEO and co-founder of BitSence, which monitors human movement and behavior in physical space. BitSence then uses this data and accompanying insights to help improve cities, architecture, and real estate developments.
Hi, this is Nissia Sabri. Thank you for joining me today. We will be talking about a smart city pilot in Boston, in particular about collecting human-centric urban data. A little bit about my background. I am a graduate of the SDM program here at MIT. I also hold a master's in physics in nuclear engineering from the University of Florida and a master in physics from a French engineering school, Grenoble Institute of Technology. I worked for 7 years in the energy sector, first as a risk analyst, working on data models and forecasts for complex systems failures. I also worked as a product manager, led product portfolio management for large and medium-sized companies in the clean energy sector. What I would like to talk to you about today, I broke the presentation in 3 parts. So the first part will give you the pilot description. What are we talking about? And help you understand the context of running a pilot in the city of Boston. The second part is normally what we do not present. And this is really unique and exclusive to this webinar. And we'll tell you more about the system architecture and how we actually designed and deployed this system. And the third part will give you a few snapshots of the data insights we were able to gather after running this pilot and collecting data from the sensors. So let's start with part 1, the pilot description. It all started with this quote. Most experiments with sensor data have taken place in silos where one technology was evaluated by itself, or in proprietary settings where data and methods are not shared publicly. We want to know how sensors designed by multiple researchers and companies that are dispersed throughout an urban environment can better inform urban planning. That's a quote from Steve Walter, director with the Boston Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, and that's what got us started. So, a bit of context on this presentation. What is it? We will be talking about a smart city pilot to inform urban interventions. Who will benefit from the information presented here? Tech companies, cities, and urban planners. And why did we feel the need to share our experience and learning? It's because we see a need for blueprints for future IoT pilots, Internet of Things, and other cities. So keep in mind that if your pilot is not actually a smart city pilot, but it's for a hospital, for an airport, for an education campus, the methods and the tools and the ideas I will be sharing with you today are applicable. And my hope is that you can take this as a blueprint and use it in your own application. So talking about smart city is like talking about world hunger. We're not going to solve all of it. And for this pilot, we really focused the goal on launching a proof of concept around showing value for implementing diverse number of sensors in a hyperlocal setting. So that was the goal we defined with our collaborators listed below. And the problem we isolated and focused on answering was to understand how people move in downtown crossing and how environmental conditions change over time. So our approach was very simple, but I will point out where it might be slightly different from your usual systems engineering. What's different are the first two steps. It actually all started by selecting a site in the city out of a number of them. And then once we selected a site, we started defining a use case to address very specific challenges to that site. We then moved into concept and architecture, and then moved into technology selection, integration and deployment, and then finally to the data processing. The scope of what we measured and how we combined it to gain knowledge on urban conditions included environmental factors such as noise, light, and air, as well as human activity. Although the planning started a few weeks in April of 2016 and then went throughout May, the actual work started in June, and within 8 weeks, we deployed on site. So what I will take you through now is really this journey from the very beginning of our design work, starting in June, all the way until we hit the street, put our system in the streets, and started collecting data. So now moving to part 2 and telling you more about the system architecture. What I would like you to really focus on here is to see to really follow our rationale and look at what can be transferred to other pilots. Just to give you a little bit more of context, this is what we are dealing with. This is a view of Boston. What's highlighted on the map is the downtown crossing area. It has a very high pedestrian traffic. It is an outdoor commercial area. And the boundary of the system we are looking at is 1 intersection and 4 street segments. For those of you who don't know downtown crossing, it's really one of the busiest areas in the downtown Boston sector. So this is how we started. We usually talk about socio-technical systems that combine technology and people. In this case, the spatial part of it was very important. So we are really looking at a spatial, social, and technological system. And these 3 layers are important. So first we started with the stakeholders, the people. It's not just about the people who use the area, but it's about people who have a say and were really necessary to make this pilot happen. So for the stakeholder groups, for the technology layer, for the urban landscape layer, we defined what were going to be our analysis layers. So for the stakeholders, we had 4 key groups: decision makers, beneficiaries, payers, and service providers. For the technology, the layers we are looking at are sensors, communication, data integration, and application. And for the urban landscape, what we felt was important was to isolate the assets it was giving us that we could use as part of our system and the constraints it was adding to us. What I would like to note here is that this is generic enough in terms of designing an IoT pilot that you could apply this to any other example. What's also key here is that if we missed any one of those layers, the pilot wouldn't have been possible. All of them were absolutely necessary from stakeholders to technology to urban landscape, if we hadn't considered them or include them, either we would have faced a risk of not moving forward, or we wouldn't have had a key component of the pilot. So let's dive into this. Starting with the stakeholders. Again, 4 groups: decision makers, beneficiaries, payers, and service providers. In our case, the first and most important decision maker was the city of Boston. It's the local government. We partnered with the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics and formed a public-private partnership to run this pilot. The other key decision maker was the urban planner and manager entity of the urban space we selected. That's the Business Improvement District in downtown Boston. Once we had those two, it meant we had the authorization to select a space and start thinking about putting sensors in it. But what was very important, and we felt that was one of the challenges many pilots faced in the IoT space, was to define a use case that actually creates value. And having the BID, the Business Improvement District in Downtown Crossing, be both a decision maker and a beneficiary helped us to flesh out what were their needs and actually define a use case. Other beneficiaries in the Boston area included the Boston Civic Media Group and the Boston Area Research Initiative, which are research groups and community advocacy groups. And these groups are important because you want their support in disseminating this technology, and they also used the output of the pilot. The payers. So let's say you have the authorization to go into the city, and let's say you have already met with the people who will benefit from your use case. We couldn't do much if we didn't have funding. So in our case, the payers were both the federal government with the Global City Teams Challenge supported by NIST and NSF, as well as MIT as an education institution through its Sandbox Innovation Fund program. Once we had the authorization, we had the use case, we had the money, we went and selected service providers. They came either as a technology sponsor, meaning giving us some of their services in kind, or they came as suppliers, where we brought our expertise as a team, and we selected the hardware and other services we needed. So once we identified these important people and we understood what their needs were, we were ready to move into requirements. Requirements are challenging, and what I chose to show you today is our thought process in saying that when you do a smart city pilot, what's interesting in your requirement gathering is that you have your traditional solution priorities. So what is the need of the what are the needs of the stakeholders? But on top of that, you have constraints that come actually from the space. So let me start with the constraints. We had no access to power in the street, so we were on our own to power our system. No access to Wi-Fi network, although there were about 25 networks where we were, but none of them was operated or owned by one of our collaborators. When we were considering solar panels, we had uneven light exposure in the street. And finally, we couldn't always put our sensors where we wanted to because people would simply take them, walk on them, damage them. And so this set of constraints was added to our list of requirements. And then based on that, we were able to define what were our functional requirements. The conflicts started becoming more obvious. We also compared our solution, or what our solution needed to do, to existing solutions to really add value as opposed to replicate. And then using this method to prioritize, we were able to have a better sense for what was feasible and what was very important for this pilot to accomplish. Once we had those, we had our stakeholders, we had our requirements ready, we moved in and started designing our concept. In this snapshot, what you see is a top view of a map that shows you the intersection in Downtown Crossing with 4 street sections. What you see are the different types of sensors we wanted to put in the street. The colors indicate different heights because the function of particular sensors were dependent on the height where we would put them. And under each one, you would see the specific type of sensing we wanted. So needless to say, this was the ideal concept for us, where we wanted to measure everything that would help us answer the questions our stakeholders had. Once we had this in mind, then we went and compared it to different topologies. What I mean by topologies is, it's one thing to have a sensor, but when you are putting a network of sensors in the street, you have to decide how that network will work. You could have one sensor talk to one gateway, that's point to point. You can have multiple sensors to talk to one gateway only, that's a star. And you could have sensors, some sensors talking to each other and really playing the role of relays, and that would be a mesh network. When we took this concept and started thinking about the topology, we realized there were a couple of things that were important. In this slide, what you see is conceptually the trade space showing utility versus costs that we went through. At the top right corner of the trade space, where you see network with single sensors in many locations, what that simply means is one option was to put many single sensors that were specialized in one type of sensing and put them all over the streets, on the doors, on the light poles, on the ground, and so forth. The other option, which is on the left lower corner, that was put all of the sensor in a single box and put it somewhere in that area. The Array of Things architecture used in Chicago relies on this architecture. There is no good or bad. Utility really depends on your own pilot, whatever you are trying to maximize and what kind of information you want to extract. In our case, the better solution was in between these two, where we had nodes that supported multiple sensors at the time, but these nodes were specialized and had different functions, and they were put out throughout those 4 street segments. I'll tell you more about how we did that. Once we had the concept, the ideal concept first, and then the one where we had to make compromises based on utility versus cost, we started thinking about actually designing the system. And we started with our architectural layers. Again, technology, we were looking at it in 4 layers: sensor, communication, data, and application. And then for each one of those layers, we looked at the modules, and then we decomposed further into hierarchical components. For this presentation, what I will talk about is the first layer, the sensor layer, with the communication layer. And the module I chose to present to you is a sensor that's tasked with environment sensing. And you will see actually that we used a platform as opposed to single devices. So our platform of environmental sensing had 2 types of sensors, one specialized in climate and one in gas. So let me show you what that looks like. First, you have the sensor, and we were looking at environmental sensing and pedestrian sensing. For this particular example, let's look at the environment sensing. You further break it down into hardware and software, and I will discuss the hardware part here. So simply put, the hardware has the sensing part and then the part that will be transmitting that information. So let's start with the sensing part. As I said before, we had two choices in the electronics. One board that would specialize in climate sensing, for which many different sensors were possible, and we chose to look at 4. temperature, humidity, light, and noise. And we had the board that was specialized in gas sensing. And we chose, again, out of the many sensor options, 4 types of gases: oxygen, NO2, CO2, and CO. The reason we chose those in this particular case was because we wanted to understand the impact of vehicle traffic in an otherwise pedestrian mall in downtown Crossing. Then, once we were set and our options were selected on the sensing part, we moved to the radio part. And that was probably where we had to look at an even greater trade space with pros and cons, and we ended up choosing a LoRa protocol for our local network. Finally, you have the supporting functions. Supporting functions mean just the basics when you think about a system or a product. It's the enclosure, it's the power, and it's the support. Where are you going to put it? And for the most part, for most engineering systems, there is no difficulty, particular difficulty here. But in our case, actually, we found that the supporting functions were creating real tension. What would have been known and testable in a normal standalone system became slightly more difficult. So let me explain what I mean by that. The first thing was the case that could be put outdoor that you put around your sensor. We found by looking at previous pilots that when in some examples, the pilots relied on 3D printed cases to very quickly prototype and run the pilot. Actually, that creates a lot of risk, and it's important to have an outdoor and weatherproof case because your calibration goes out of the window if you don't, and also the damage is more likely. Moving to the power, we don't have plugs, and as you will see, even though we chose as a supporting infrastructure lighting poles, well, lighting poles are actually not lit during the day, so they are dead. There is no power. So we had to power our devices with a battery, and we had to think about how to recharge that battery, and we ended up using solar panel. And finally, as I mentioned, the supporting part of it, sensors don't float in the street, and sometimes you don't have the right to actually drill or stick something on a wall. So you really need to understand the ownership that happens in a public space so that you can request the right authorization from the person who is managing that infrastructure. And one last thing I would like to point out here is the fact that if we were able to combine all of our supporting functions in one, meaning that the urban infrastructure, if it were able to provide support, power, and enclosure, then we would be able to scale and really not face high risks of deploying systems that would fail because one of these 3 issues. So the downtown crossing sensing infrastructure looks something like this. You have nodes that are specialized in environmental sensing, including temperature, humidity, luminosity, and noise. Close by, and in a perpendicular street, you have air quality sensors. And the reason we deploy them this way is to be able to do comparative studies between different streets. And then finally, you had the human mobility sensor, which needed to be in an enclosed area and needed power because of the sampling frequency we needed. So we ended up using 2 types of infrastructure. One is the lighting poles, and the second one are kiosks. So we used a florist kiosk that's available in downtown Crossing. Testing and validation, again, there is nothing very different from what you would do for a system, any technology. What I would like to point out here is the last row of this table, is software site validation. Of course, we did test and validate the sensors on their own in the lab. Of course, we did test and validate the network, so the sensors and the gateway. And we also tested the entire system when it's transmitting to the cloud. The surprise was, one, testing only the sensors by themselves, you cannot uncover one type of failure that only happens when they are working as a network. We were having frames dropping. The second piece is the local and external database synchronization that was not happening, even though we were testing the gateway with the sensors, and you needed really the connection to the cloud to be able to know that. What I think really interesting here is the fact that we did it in a lab and it worked. We took it to the site and it didn't. And the reason is that we faced RF interferences that made the frame drop more permanent, and we had some uncertainty and really some issues with the connection of the gateway to the internet because we were using shared hardware, which was not the case in the lab. So I think one of the learnings from the testing and validation step when you are running a smart city pilot is really the testing is not done until you deploy and you test in real conditions that you wouldn't otherwise be able to simulate in a lab. After we tested everything, we went on site, worked with the business improvement district in downtown Crossing and deployed the sensors as you can see on the maps. And we were live exactly 8 weeks on August 10th after we started designing the system. A few highlights from operation, just looking at, we broke them down into external factors and internal factors. Few external factors that were surprising to us and that are very much linked to the fact that you are doing things in a busy intersection in the city. So we had to deal with liability. We were a private-public partnership with many stakeholders. So who was liable for harm to people walking by if somehow one of our sensors fell? We also had to think about hardware theft and physical damage. We had to respect the aesthetics of the place. There is a lot of investment that goes into making downtown Crossing a really appealing and nice area. And the last thing anyone wanted was to have industrial-looking, not so nice boxes hanging from the lighting poles. So we had to work with flower pots and other things to really hide the infrastructure and make it really look seamlessly integrated. We also faced poor sun exposure in some cases where the solar panels were not as effective. And as I mentioned before, RF interferences and frame drops. Some internal factors we had to deal with in maintenance was, again, when the exposure was not sufficient, battery charging, as well as Ethernet connection issues. That was it. That's the system. 8 weeks from starting, on day one, we had no team, no money, no technology, no use case. In 8 weeks, this was built. I would like to emphasize that because that tells you that there is real value, one, in creating collaborations, and you can do it at any scale, and there is no replacement for the learning you get from actually doing it and doing it fairly fast to be able to then scale. So let me show you a little bit of the data insights we gained from putting sensors in downtown Crossing, again, with the objective to understand how people move and use downtown Crossing, as well as the environmental factors that you would experience if you were to go to downtown Crossing. We collected a lot of data over a long period of time, and as a matter of fact, we also ran a parallel pilot in a residential area because one of the value of collecting data is to be able to compare it over time and over space and really understand what makes downtown Crossing a commercial area different from your typical residential neighborhood. So this is the data universe that, and what's highlighted in the black boxes is the selected path for today's presentation of the results. Let's start with something we all love, noise. So we know it's loud. It's of course a commercial and pedestrian area. So what we wanted to know was what were the level of noise we were seeing. Actually, there are legal limits that would mean that if you exceed them, you are in violation of regulations. What's interesting is that regulations don't always adapt as fast as the changing environment around them. And this was one way, for instance, to be able to quantify what portion of those peaks, noise peaks, we were seeing that would theoretically exceed the legal limit. So let me help you read the slide. On the right-hand side, you have Summer Street. It's one of the streets we measured. And on the left-hand side, it's Winter. For the next slides, it will be the same structure, summer on one side, winter on the other side. What you see, actually, is that for most of the time, the baseline in Summer Street is high. It actually makes sense. There are tables, there are chairs, people hang out there. When there is an event, because of the open space, it usually happens there. As a matter of fact, you even see we're pointing to a crowd there. That was something we were able to correlate social media data as well as noise data to understand that such sustained levels and peaks of noise were actually a crowd that gathered in downtown Crossing. On the left-hand side with Winter, you see the baseline is lower, but what's important to note is that the high peaks are more frequent. So it might be a little bit more annoying to live on Winter Street than to live on Summer. Actually, we looked at the data from a different point of view, and that happens to be really one of the insights. Starting with Summer Street. Summer tends to be louder, but the peak noise window was happening between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. It kind of makes sense. It's lunch hour, and it's a shopping area. And most of the time, so actually more precisely, 66% of the time, Summer Street sounds like louder than a passing train. If you look at Winter Street, it's really quiet. It's only about 7% of the time louder than a passing train. But if you look at the windows of peak noise, they happen between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. and 11. You definitely would be bothered if you were a resident living on Winter as opposed to Summer Street. Then we looked at light. So why is it important? Light was important both for the city and for the bid in downtown Crossing because it's something you can do something about, right? So if we start with Summer Street, what the peaks are telling us, if you look at them, they are slightly wider than the peaks on Winter Street on the left. It means it gets better natural light exposure. If you're an architect or an urban planner, you already know that. If you know the neighborhood very well, you also would know that. But if you don't and you haven't visited, that's what it's telling you. What's interesting is if you look at the minimums are telling us that at night, Summer Street is better lit than Winter Street. And that was something that the city pointed out and noticed because you can change street light. And we know that street light at night is very often correlated to feeling of safety and how likely people maybe would come or stay in a given area. We also looked at fraction of the time where you have a bright day, a bright window, and it's larger in summer than it is in winter. What we looked at next was air, and let me start with the disclaimer. We are not air experts, so we did measure air, some gases, but air quality, even today, even with the more expensive types of sensors that you can find on the market, is a very difficult nut to crack. EPA researchers are working on it. There are many researchers still working on it. What happens, and what we found to be true, was that calibration of the sensors is very difficult, it's very sensitive. You might buy a few $1,000s sensor for air quality, it will drift after a while, and it won't be calibrated like it came from the vendors. In our case, we actually used sensors that were a fraction of the cost, that were 10 times cheaper, non-calibrated, and we tried to see if we could look at the relative difference between streets and between hours. The only thing we were able to really say for certain is that there was more CO, for instance, midday in the afternoon than during the rest of the 24-hour period. We also looked at in a similar way at CO2 levels, and again, it looks like it's following a pattern of activity during the day where we are most likely also to find vehicle traffic. Let me jump to human activity, and that's the last part of the data we collected and analyzed. We wanted to know if there was a pattern in the days of people coming to downtown crossing. We found two interesting things we wanted to show you here. The first one is 80% of the people never stopped at the location where we were sensing. They were essentially, for all intents and purposes, either commuters or one-time visitors. Only 20% actually stopped or returned. And when we compared weekdays to weekends, what you can clearly see is that Saturday and Sunday have a different pattern than the rest of the week, and actually they have less people. So when you pause and think about it, downtown crossing is a commercial shopping area. It should be busy on the weekends, and what this was indicating was that, in fact, there were a lot of commuters going through downtown crossing, and the value that you get from the shoppers, there were less of them on the weekends. So we wanted to look at what happens in downtown crossing, being a commercial district, compared to a residential neighborhood, to really start to understand differences in scale. So you see a morning peak at 8 a.m. in downtown crossing on the right, and you see an afternoon peak at 5 p.m. If you look at the same 24-hour window in a residential neighborhood, the scale is very different, and you would also see those peaks around commuting hours, but not as sharply defined as the 8 and the 5. We were really intrigued by the fact that there were less people coming on the weekend than during the weekday, and wanted to understand whether they had a different behavior when they came during the weekend versus weekday. And what we looked at was the duration of stay from the time they came to downtown crossing until they left. And what we found was that they were more likely to break the 2-hour stay duration during the weekend at many more times during the day than they were during a weekday. So weekday, commuters peaks at 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., staying a shorter period of time than on the weekend. And that concludes the data. So to summarize what we saw in the presentation, what we covered, so we started with a site selection that was in Boston downtown crossing. Then we defined a use case with the stakeholder for that site to really understand a problem that they are facing or a question they wanted to answer. Once we had a good grasp of what the use case, the needs, and the requirements were, we moved to define the concept and the detailed architecture. We showed you a very small snapshot of that today, but we did that for every aspect of the system. We then looked at a more realistic constrained system, as well as utility versus cost for our specific application, and we proceeded to select the technology that was the best fit. We then took that to downtown crossing, and working with our collaborators there, deployed. The whole cycle took 8 weeks until that point, and then we collected data for 2 months and did data processing on 4 factors. noise, light, air, and human activity. And of course, all this magic wouldn't be possible if we didn't have a great team behind BitSence. So my teammates are not here, but I would like to thank them. Ariana Salazar, architect and urban planner, and Amaral Seed, software engineer, all three of us MIT grads. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
All right, I am going to read aloud questions. Please feel free to keep entering them in the chat section. We will answer as many as we can, or until we run out of questions. So I'm going to start with a kind of general question from Eric Carlson. He asks, will you explain what makes this pilot human-centric as opposed to just environmental/human monitoring?
Sure. It's a very good question. So it has to do with the use case. If you remember at the very beginning, what we were saying was the pilot was run to do better urban interventions. So actually what the BID, the Business Improvement District in Downtown Crossing, wanted to do, they wanted to change the landscape in Downtown Crossing. What we mean by that is putting chairs, putting tables, creating areas where people could sit, closing roads, because Downtown Crossing officially is actually a pedestrian mall. But if you spend any amount of time in Downtown Crossing, you quickly realize that there is a fair amount of vehicle traffic. That became a safety issue. So the goal of the stakeholders or the entity that actually manages that space was to make the space work for the people who are there. And short of asking them and running in-person surveys, either by sitting there or observing, the next best thing was actually a combination of factors that are passively collecting information and analyzing how people change their behavior as you are making changes, comparing the before and after. It's a part I didn't present here, but that was very much at the heart of, can we change things and understand how people change their behavior as a result? And the goal is to make it better for people to come back and stay.
Next up, a question from Manan03. Seems like you did a lot of the IoT design ground up yourself. Did you find any of the available reference IoT platforms a good starting point?
So you are right. We did a lot of the design of the system ourselves. If you go back to one of the early slides that all started out from Steve Walter, one of the first things we realized was that cities didn't have a shortage of companies trying to sell to them a vertically integrated solution that had everything from the sensor to the cloud. But what's difficult is to be able, as a city or as a company or an entity, to buy from different vendors and have all this information integrated and not have to deal with different separate systems that cannot be interoperable. So we made a very conscious decision of saying, we're not going to start by just picking what's out there because it comes with already very clear limitation. It works great if you take the entire system with one vendor, but if you want to combine and open it up to different types of vendors, it's very hard to do the integration. Then we used some of the platforms. For instance, we did use developer kits, SDKs, for some of the hardware we ordered. We looked at different options of vendors for hardware, and we also looked at different types of cloud services. What we picked were all the options that gave us the greatest flexibility in programming, in changing the functions, and in making things talk to each other.
All right, it looks like you answered a couple of questions that people had more specifically about using Libelium kits and Amazon Web Services, and another question about what platform you use to host and process the data. But if you could expand a little on your last answer to give more specific,
sure.
if possible.
Sure. So what we found interesting, again, in the pilot is there is no shortage of vendors out there, selling everything from sensors, from integrated kits. One thing is that none of the manufacturer's specs actually work, in real life, and that's not a surprise, and that's, a disclaimer you would find in any manufacturer specs. So nothing is ready just to unpack and plug if you truly want a solution that works for your problem, as opposed to something that's just gonna collect a deluge of data and then store it somewhere. So we found, yes, we actually tried other vendors. We found the Libelium kits useful, but it's something that comes with an intense 8 weeks of programming and work, and you need system integrators on the team, you need software programmers. Nobody will know what sampling rates you need, what transmission power works best for you, how to make a trade-off between your battery power and what you are collecting, and so forth. What AWS was convenient for us. We also looked at IBM and we looked at really other clouds. But one thing I also didn't mention, we wanted to look at MQTT protocol, for those of you who are familiar with it, because we were very interested in having real-time and possibly feedback from the sensors to the infrastructure in the street. And we felt that AWS actually offered both the long-term SQL database storage as well as the real-time feedback. I hope this answers the question.
All right, we also have a couple of similar questions from Carol Ann McDevitt and Stephen Gatchell about how did your team measure how long individuals stayed in the area and how long people stayed on weekends?
So there are a couple of things you can pick. Again, there are options. I think what was important for us was to understand, to break it into layers and to understand what were the specific characteristics that would answer a question like, if I put a table and a chair, will it lead to people staying longer and therefore being more likely to shop in my area? So you can use infrared for people counting, you can use camera for storefront analytics, you can use device sensors. What we tried to do was, one, go towards a technology that was that would respect privacy. So cameras, in some cases, at least for our application, were not the best way. We did device actually counting as opposed to people, because we felt the level of anonymity would be what would work for our project. We anonymized, we encrypted, we didn't use camera, we didn't use sound. So when I say noise, we really didn't record any conversation. It was, again, just levels of readings. And for us, that gave us the three characteristics we were looking for, which was the number, how long they stayed, and then the rate of return.
All right, and one last question from Eduardo De Oro. He's interested to know more about final users. Who are people interested in the data? He says he's in the emergency sector and was curious about whether fire brigades or similar entities were also interested in the data.
That's a fantastic question. As a matter of fact, so our team, BitSence, just moved back into MIT as part of an accelerator, DesignX, which is bringing together startups that are working on technologies and services for the built environment. And one of the use cases we are seeing that would be extremely interesting is actually for emergency evacuation. That's something that's not necessarily high-tech right now, or not to the potential it could be. And it is something we are actually investigating and having talks with MIT here. So if you're interested in following up or having conversation on site, I would love to connect with you. Otherwise, the use cases, use cases and people using actually this kind of data or interested in this kind of data, I think what's really important to understand is that data doesn't mean anything. It's not the bottom line, it's the insights you get from it. What people want to know is, how can I improve my sales? Is what I did actually working? So it's not about the table or the graph, it's about having also somebody on the team who is able to translate those. Our teammate, who is architect and urban planner, played a key role in actually this translation with the stakeholders. We also worked with another team of architect and urban planners. My final thought about this is, I think there is a push, a technology push in the space of smart cities and IoT. But we need a better connection to the actual users, because we are creating data for systems or processes that don't exist yet on their side. And I think the earlier we bring them in, and the more we do it, the better we will know how you can help your mom and pop shop in a business district, or a bank give loans to people who will open maybe a business, or hospital run better. I think we need to bring those who will benefit more closer into the loop.
That's a great answer. We have, I think, one more question right now from Alem Baragasesa. I apologize if I butcher any of these names, who asks, how do you design for conducted noise to assure clean data?
For, I'm not sure.
For conducted noise.
So noise was an interesting environmental factor. So if you think about the other ones we were measuring, for instance, light, temperature, humidity, we didn't need a sampling rate that was very high, because the truth is temperature and humidity and light wasn't changing that much in a short period of time. With noise, we faced really a trade-off, because to be able, we needed a very high sampling rate if we wanted to recreate the actual noise signal, understand whether it was a truck, a car, or a person. But the point was not actually for us to do that level of analysis, so we chose to sample at a lower rate, not have the highest fidelity data, so it wasn't about the accuracy, it was more about the consistency, and we were interested in finding those peaks that would create for this up-and-coming really neighborhood that's becoming a mixed use where you have residents, where there are things that the city or the manager of the space could do, for instance, to prevent delivery trucks from coming at 3 a.m. and maybe push them to later, or trash picking truck. And what we found, if you look back at the graphs, was we were able, with the sampling rates we chose, to identify crowds that were staying in the area for longer periods of time, or sustained periods of time. And for us, it was enough, it was sufficient, again, because the intent was not to classify. It was rather to look at peaks and then to look at sustained activity in the site.
All right, it looks like those are all of the questions we have. So on behalf of SDM, I'd like to thank Nissia for delivering a really interesting and wonderful presentation, and I'd like to thank everyone who attended for your interest. As mentioned earlier, you'll be sent a link to the recording of today's webinar in about 1 week, along with the speaker's contact information. Our next SDM webinar is scheduled for March 13th with SDM alum Oluwasoga Oni, who's the CEO of MDAS. He will discuss using systems thinking to create affordable access to medical devices in Africa. You'll be sent more information about this webinar when we send you the follow-up email mentioned earlier. We hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we welcome your feedback. Thank you for attending.